I never thought that my life could change so drastically in a single moment. Love with Lindsay seemed like something unbreakable, something that nothing and no one could destroy. I still remember the day we met for the first time, how she walked into that little cafe on the street corner where I was having my morning coffee. I took one look at her and knew immediately that this was the moment that would change my life. Her blonde hair falling softly over her shoulders, blue eyes and a smile that made the whole world seem a little brighter. She sat down at the table across from me, and while I tried to focus on my phone, my thoughts were all about her. I'd been single for a while by then, and to be honest, I wasn't really looking forward to diving back into a relationship. Past attempts to build something serious had burned me too badly, and I was afraid of being in that position again. But with Lindsay, things were different. The moment our gazes met, I felt like something was about to happen. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the one. We started talking, first exchanging a couple phrases about how good the coffee here was, and then the conversation took a turn where we couldn't stop anymore. I learned that she had just moved to our city, and that she had graduated from university and was now working for a major advertising agency. Her dreams and ambition amazed me. She had that fire in her eyes that attracted me and made me believe that she knew what she wanted out of life. We exchanged phone numbers, and the very next day we agreed to meet again. It was the beginning of something special, something I considered destiny. The meetings became regular, and soon I realized that I wasn't just attracted to this girl. I was in love. We spent hours walking the streets of the city, talking about everything from our childhood memories to our future plans. She seemed perfect. Things went easy with Lindsay, like we were made for each other. We could sit in coffee shops and be silent, but even that silence seemed filled with meaning. After a few months, I couldn't imagine my life without her. We seemed to complement each other perfectly. I often found myself thinking that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. It was a little scary, because feelings like that rarely come so quickly, but I couldn't fight what I was feeling. Time passed, and our relationship grew deeper and deeper. Lindsay moved in with me a year after we started dating, and it seemed like a logical step. Our days became more casual, but there was a beauty to it. Breakfast together in the mornings, dinners in the kitchen with a glass of wine, quiet evenings in front of the TV, it was all part of the little universe we'd created together. But sometimes there was a shadow in her eyes. It was unremarkable, but it still made me think. In those moments, when I started to ask her what was bothering her, Lindsay just waved it off, saying that nothing was wrong. I convinced myself that it wasn't worth worrying about, that it was all small stuff. We were happy, at least that's how it seemed to me. I trusted her because I just didn't see any other option. She was everything to me. Our lives went on as normal until one day, after almost 2 years of relationship, Lindsay broke the news to me that turned my reality upside down. It was an ordinary evening. We were sitting at the table eating dinner when she suddenly looked at me with a serious look in her eyes and told me she had some big news for me. "Peter, I'm pregnant." Her words seemed to catch me off guard, even though it was something we had talked about a lot before. In that second, I felt something inside me flare up. It wasn't just a shock. It was an amazing feeling of joy, pride, and happiness. I had always wanted children, and the thought that I would soon be a father filled me to the brim. "Are you serious?" I asked, not believing my ears. "Yes," she nodded, smiling at me the way only she knew how, with warmth and gentleness. The world became brighter in that moment, as if every element of our apartment, every sound outside the window, took on new meaning. I hugged her, felt her pressed against me, and realized that everything I'd ever wanted was finally coming true. We were going to be a family. I remember that night we discussed names for the baby to be. Lindsay had always wanted a girl, and we even started joking about what strict parents we would be. At that moment, I was sure that life was going exactly the way it should. All the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But then something changed. Not all at once, but gradually. Lindsay became a little different. Her moods changed, and she became withdrawn, sometimes irritable. I tried to explain it as hormones, because pregnancy is always stressful, but one thought kept me thinking. Why is she acting so strange? Why do I no longer feel the closeness that we used to have? More and more often, she began to say that she needed time to herself, that she was tired, that she wanted to be alone. I tried not to intrude, though I was growing restless inside. Our conversations about the future became less frequent, replaced by long pauses and strained silence. I tried to be supportive somehow, thinking that maybe she just needed more attention. I started making her breakfast in bed, buying her flowers, trying to do everything I could to make her feel loved. But one day, something inside me clicked. I noticed how she started texting a lot when she thought I wasn't noticing. Her phone had never been something forbidden to me, but now she was constantly tucking it away in her bag or pocket, as if she was hiding something. The thought haunted me. What if it wasn't what I thought it was? What if she hadn't been honest with me all this time? That night, as she fell asleep, her phone vibrated on the bedside table. I stared at it for a long time before deciding to pick it up. After that night, when I'd read the message from Josh, I couldn't get it out of my head. It was short, but it completely confused me. "How are you? How's the baby doing?" Those few words came out of the blue. Why was he asking about the baby? How did Josh even know she was pregnant? And most importantly, why did this message sound like he knew something about the baby that I didn't? I hesitated to start talking to Lindsay right away, too afraid I might ruin everything in a fit of emotion. And I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on one message. There's no telling. Maybe it was just an innocent question from an old acquaintance that didn't matter. After all, I couldn't be sure that something was going on between them just because of one short text, but the thought kept me on my toes. Every minute I felt more and more that our happiness was hanging by a thread, and if I didn't deal with it, things could go south. In the days that followed, I tried to get our routine back on track. We continued to live our lives as before, but I began to notice that Lindsay had changed. She no longer talked about the baby's future with the same enthusiasm. We used to discuss names, talk about how we'd set up the nursery, plan trips to buy everything we needed. Now those conversations seemed tortured. She often brushed it off, saying she didn't have the energy or that she needed time to rest. Her fatigue seemed plausible to me, after all. Pregnancy can be exhausting, especially early on. But it was more than that. Lindsay began to withdraw into herself more and more, spending time alone. We didn't go out as often as we used to, and if we did, the walks were short and aimless. One evening when I got home from work, I saw her sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands. Lindsay quickly put it away as soon as she noticed me, and the movement made me wary. I remember my heart clenched, but I decided not to talk about it at that moment. Maybe I'm putting too much pressure on myself. Maybe it was just work stuff or socializing with friends that wasn't worth my attention. But my suspicions were growing. I began to notice that Lindsay was sitting with her phone more and more often, but she never left it in plain sight. She even took it with her to the bathroom, even though it had never been her habit before. Talking on the phone became rare, but texting became more frequent. Every time I tried to approach her or ask her who she was texting, she just smiled and said it didn't matter. One day I couldn't take it anymore. We were sitting in the kitchen at dinner, and I felt like I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Lindsay," I began, trying to speak as calmly as I could. "You've been on the phone a lot lately. Is it all with your friends or someone else?" She looked up at me, her face perfectly calm. "Well, mostly with my friends," she answered, as if the question was unexpected. "And Josh?" I asked bluntly, feeling my stomach clench with tension. Her gaze froze for a second, but she quickly pulled herself together. "We've texted a few times," she admitted with a slight shrug. It didn't mean anything, just keeping in touch. Those words gave me mixed feelings. I wanted to believe her, but I remembered the message I'd read on her phone. Why was he asking about the baby? Was there really nothing going on between them? I decided not to delve into that conversation at that moment, feeling like I might make a mistake by getting emotional. But that only reinforced my doubts. After our brief but intense conversation, I realized that Lindsay wasn't going to tell me the whole truth. There was something unsettling in her answers, as if she knew I suspected something wrong but didn't want it to come out. I was torn between conflicting feelings. I loved her and wanted to keep our relationship intact, but the sense of betrayal was becoming too obvious to ignore. Doubts became my constant shadow, and I thought more and more often that perhaps the truth was something I would have to find out for myself. Every day, her behavior became more and more aloof. Lindsay often stayed home, citing fatigue, but her phone was never far away. She no longer left it on the table or nightstand like she used to, and if she did, the screen was always locked. It was starting to annoy me. I had never paid attention to her texts or calls before, but now any interaction she had with her phone made me suspicious. I began to think that maybe I needed to learn more before confronting her directly. I knew my actions might not look right, but an inner voice told me that without action, I would only sink further into doubt. I decided I needed to find out more about her correspondence with Josh. Once again, when Lindsay went to the bathroom and left her phone on the bedside table, I grabbed it and quickly started going through the messages. Guilt plagued me, but the desire to know the truth was stronger. There were no long conversations in my correspondence with Josh, just short messages, exchanged mostly with duty phrases. How are you? How are you feeling? How's the pregnancy going? However, that was what scared me. He was asking about the baby as if he was directly involved in this pregnancy. A sense of panic swept over me. I was sure Josh wasn't just an old acquaintance of hers. There was more to it than that, but what it was I had yet to find out. Lindsay came out of the bathroom just as I was putting my phone away, but my heart was racing. I tried to look as calm as I could, but everything was churning inside me. Her face was as calm as it usually was, but I couldn't trust that appearance anymore. In that moment, I realized that there was no turning back for me. I had to find out what was really going on. The next day, I made an important decision. I decided to talk to her friend Ashley, who Lindsay often socialized with. Ashley and I had never been particularly close, but I knew she could shed some light on the situation. I called her, making the excuse that I wanted to surprise Lindsay and needed her opinion. Ashley, as always, was good-natured and agreed to meet. We sat at the coffee shop and I got right to the point. Ashley, I know this may sound strange, but I have serious suspicions about Lindsay. I don't want to drag you into this, but I need to find out, do you know who she's been hanging out with lately? I paused, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Do you know anything about Josh? Ashley frowned slightly, clearly surprised by my question. Josh? You mean her ex-boyfriend? She clarified, and there was a slight awkwardness in her voice. Well, yeah, I know they text sometimes, but Lindsay never told me it was anything serious. As far as I know, they're just friends. I froze, trying not to betray my inner panic. Are you sure? I asked again. Did she talk about him a lot? Ashley shrugged slightly. Honestly, not really. Lindsay talked more about you and the baby. She always seemed so happy with you. Her words should have reassured me, but they only made me feel more insecure. If Ashley didn't know, then Lindsay was really hiding something important, and that something had to do with Josh. I thanked her for talking to me, but I left the cafe with an even heavier heart. That night, I couldn't contain my thoughts. I tried to act normal, but the only thing running through my mind was, what was Lindsay hiding? We ate dinner in silence, and I sensed that she understood something, but she didn't want to bring it up. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Lindsay, I began with a serious tone, I can't ignore this anymore. What's going on between you and Josh? She looked at me, her face tense for a moment, but then she took a deep breath. Peter, we've talked about this before. Her voice was calm, but I could see that she was preparing herself for the conversation. There is nothing between us. I broke up with him a long time ago and you know it. Then why is he asking about the baby? Why is he acting like that baby could be his? Her eyes widened, and I saw her bite her lip, clearly considering how to answer. Peter! Her voice was soft, but I could hear a hint of desperation in it. It's just a random question. Josh knows I'm pregnant, and he was just curious. Nothing more. I don't know what you're imagining, but it's not true. I couldn't listen to her excuses anymore. Everything inside me was screaming that she was lying. But even then, I wasn't ready to hear the truth. Lindsay, my voice shook with tension. If it's not true, prove it to me. Tell me that the baby is really mine." She froze. She was silent for a few seconds, and in those seconds I realized I already knew the answer. Her face darkened slightly and she looked away. "Peter, you know it's not that simple," she said quietly. The words sounded like a sentence. My heart sank, and I felt the whole world collapse around me. In that second, I realized that all my worst fears had been confirmed. After our tense conversation, I sat in silence, feeling everything inside me slowly churning with doubt. Lindsay froze, looking at me with an expression as if she was about to say something, but would change her mind at the last moment. I didn't know what to think, and every beat of my heart echoed in my ears. My faith in her was hanging by a thin thread, and I knew that one more wrong word and that thread would be severed. Finally, Lindsay took a deep breath and said softly, "Peter, the baby is yours. I would never hurt you this way, please believe me." Her voice was quiet but calm. There wasn't the slightest hint of a lie in those words. I looked into her eyes, trying to catch something that might confirm my suspicions, but there was only a sincere desire to convince me that everything was okay. Lindsay's words slowly began to settle in my mind, and in that moment I felt the tension I'd been carrying around all these weeks begin to slowly let go. My love for her was too strong to continue doubting after her reassurances. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, and it finally calmed me down. I took a deep breath and tried to smile. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling stupid for all my suspicions. I'm confused. All this pressure, the pregnancy, the future, the thoughts that we have to be perfect parents, it's all too much. I'm sorry for my doubts." Lindsay looked at me with relief, as if a mountain had been lifted off her shoulders. She took my hand and squeezed it. "It's okay, Peter. I understand. It's hard for both of us." That was the end of the conversation. I didn't have any more doubts. I believed what she said. She was mine, and the child she was expecting was ours. We went on with our lives as before, and I tried to forget my fears. Weeks passed, and slowly our lives began to return to normal. Lindsay's pregnancy was becoming more and more visible as her belly rounded out, and every time I saw her stroking it with her hand, my heart filled with joy. We started talking about the future again, about what our baby would be like. Lindsay was calm and relaxed, and I began to feel again that everything in our lives was going right. The first ultrasound was a big moment for both of us. We arrived at the clinic, and I sat next to Lindsay, holding her hand. Excitement was in the air, but it was a nice excitement. The doctor ran a probe over her abdomen, and the screen came to life, showing a small life form inside. At that moment, I felt tears come to my eyes. We were seeing our baby. It was an incredible feeling. "There's his heartbeat right there," the doctor said, pointing to a small pulsing spot on the screen. Lindsay smiled as she looked at me, and I could see she was happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt real peace of mind. The baby was healthy. Everything was going as it should. We started discussing names, planning the nursery. It was everything we had dreamed of. After the ultrasound, Lindsay became much more active. She started preparing for the future, buying clothes for the baby, choosing furniture for the nursery. We discussed colors, furniture, toys. Her enthusiasm was returning, and it gave me even more confidence that everything was going well. Sometimes I noticed her talking to the baby while stroking her belly. It was a touching sight, and each time I felt like our bond was only getting stronger. We also started taking childbirth education classes. I was skeptical at first, but once we started attending classes, I realized how important it was. We learned proper breathing. We learned about how labor works, and it all made our preparation for our baby together more real. Lindsay laughed when I tried to repeat relaxation exercises, but I knew it would all help us in the future. Our lives were slowly taking on a new meaning. We were getting ready to become parents, and although I still felt a slight anxiety about what was ahead of us, that anxiety was already a nice, natural feeling. Lindsay seemed happier, and I was beginning to feel more confident as well. Her concern for herself and the baby filled me with pride, and our conversations about the future brought back the warmth I had once feared losing. One night as we were eating dinner, Lindsay suddenly looked up at me with a smile. "You know," she began, "I think we're going to get through this. You're going to be an amazing father." Her words were so sincere and kind, I couldn't help but smile back. "I hope you're right," I replied, feeling light and happy. "But I know one thing for sure. You're going to be a wonderful mother." Lindsay laughed and put her hand on her stomach. "You know, he's already pushing. Can you feel it?" She brought my hand to her belly and I felt the slight tremors. It was incredible. It was the moment that finally calmed me down. All my doubts, all the anxieties I had felt before disappeared. We were on the threshold of a new stage of life, and now I was sure that with Lindsay we would succeed. Time passed, and Lindsay's pregnancy was approaching its third trimester. We talked more and more about giving birth, choosing a hospital, and discussing plans for the future. She was feeling relatively well, although she was tired at times. But I was doing my best to support her. We spent more time together, taking walks in the park, reading books about parenting. I felt like our lives were finally on the right track. I was ready to be a father. And most importantly, I trusted Lindsay again. Every move she made, every concern she had for our future child confirmed that she was telling the truth. As the months passed, our lives really began to return to normal. Lindsay increasingly seemed happy, caring, and most importantly to me, completely sincere. I began to trust her again. We looked forward to the moment when our baby would be born. I no longer saw the need to suspect her. Everything she said, everything she did, seemed to be true. I accepted her words that the baby was mine, and that was my mainstay. The childbirth preparation course was coming to an end, and we both felt ready for whatever was ahead of us. Lindsay talked more and more about how much she wanted to see our baby boy. We discussed his future, dreaming about what he would be like, how we would raise him. These conversations filled me with happiness and confidence. Everything was as it should be in a perfect relationship. But sometimes I caught myself thinking strange thoughts. Everything seemed to be perfect, but somewhere deep inside me there was a tiny shadow of doubt. I tried to ignore it. After all, Lindsay had proven to me that she was honest, that she loved me. I told myself it was just my old fears, remnants of the anxiety that had once plagued me. And yet, sometimes at night I would lie awake and think, what if I was wrong after all? One night, when I couldn't sleep, I turned to Lindsay and saw her sleeping peacefully with her hand on her stomach. I felt that strange contrast between happiness and an elusive sense of unease again. I got out of bed to get a drink of water, and as I walked past her phone, which she'd left on the nightstand, I noticed the screen flickered again with a new message. I stopped. For a moment, I froze, feeling that old restlessness wake up again. All those moments when I doubted Lindsay, her conversations with Josh, her behavior, came back into my mind. But it was different now because she'd already convinced me that there was nothing between them. I sighed, looked away, and went into the kitchen. It was my own personal moment of weakness that I chose to ignore. I wasn't going to rehash the past again. I told myself that I didn't want to do anything else that would ruin our happiness. But, as is often the case, thoughts of the past don't disappear so easily. The next day, I felt that slight tension between us again when Lindsay stayed late to meet her friends. I didn't want to think about the fact that something suspicious was going on, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. I began to notice little details that hadn't caught my eye before. She started leaving for errands a little more often than she had earlier in the pregnancy. Sometimes her answers to questions sounded a little mechanical. Maybe it was all my paranoia. Maybe the hormonal changes were affecting her behavior. But I couldn't ignore the feeling. The doctor showed us on the screen how he was moving, and it was another moment where I felt a real closeness to Lindsay and our future. The baby was our shared happiness, and in that moment, all my doubts receded once again. I saw Lindsay looking at the screen with love and care, and in that moment, I couldn't doubt that she was telling the truth. We came home that day hugging each other, discussing how soon everything would change when the baby came into the world. But everything changed one morning. Lindsay was sitting in the kitchen, and I noticed she was texting someone again. Normally, I wouldn't pay attention to this since all my old fears were long gone, but something about her behavior struck me as odd. It was like she was a little nervous as she quickly tucked her phone away in her pocket after noticing my gaze. I didn't want to broach the subject again, but the tension in the air was palpable. "Who are you texting with?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. "A friend," she answered, avoiding my gaze. I felt a familiar feeling, as if time had fallen back to the days when I couldn't trust her completely, but I didn't want to believe that now. Lindsay noticed my concern, and with a sigh looked up at me. "Peter, what's going on?" she asked, a little irritated. "You know I love you, don't you? You know it's okay." I froze, trying to figure out where this doubt was coming from again. Was it just my anxiety before labor? Or was it something more? But her confident tone began to blur my fears again. "I'm sorry," I answered after a pause. "It's just that I'm worried. The pregnancy, the future. I feel like I can't handle those thoughts sometimes." She smiled and moved closer to me. "It's going to be okay, Peter," she said softly. "We're going to be parents soon, and everything will change." Her words brought me back to reality again. I felt the tension slowly let go. Lindsay was right. Our worries and anxieties about the future are normal before a big event like the birth of a child. And in that moment, I believed again that we could handle it. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that everything was under control, that morning left a mark on me. I started watching Lindsay more closely again, though I tried not to show it. I wanted to make sure my fears were in vain, that nothing had changed between us. But every time she put the phone away or quickly changed the topic of conversation, I was plunged back into my old doubts. Lindsay seemed happy and relaxed, and our days were filled with the pleasant hassle of preparing for the birth of our baby. When we found out we were having a boy, it was another bright spot that strengthened our relationship. We immediately started thinking about what we would name him, imagining what he would be like, and how we would raise him together. I remember Lindsay, beaming with joy, suggesting several names for the boy. She smiled as if there wasn't a trace of her former anxiety left inside her. "What do you think of the name Liam?" she asked one evening when we were discussing what our son would be. "Liam?" I thought about it for a moment, saying the name out loud, as if trying to get a feel for whether it was right for our future child. "I like it. It's a strong name." We kept going through the options, laughing and joking, until we settled on 2 or 3 names we both liked. These conversations brought calm and reassurance that everything would be okay. Lindsay's pregnancy progressed normally. She had regular checkups with the doctor, and all the tests showed that the baby was developing as it should. The doctor reassured us, telling us not to worry and that everything was going well. I began to help Lindsay around the house more, trying not to overburden her as her belly grew larger, and I could see that it was getting harder for her to do normal activities. Our days were quiet. We picked out furniture for the nursery together, argued about what color the walls should be, and bought clothes for the newborn. Every night, Lindsay told me how she felt the baby moving inside her, and I looked forward to seeing him and holding him in my arms. One of the highlights was when Lindsay felt our son pushing for the first time. We were lying on the couch watching a movie, and suddenly she pressed my hand to her belly. "Did you feel that?" she asked, smiling broadly. My hand froze on her stomach, and I did feel a slight nudge. It was an amazing feeling, as if someone small inside welcomed me. This event reinforced my sense of responsibility and closeness to our future family. Gradually, the due date for labor was approaching, and Lindsay was talking more and more about how hard it was for her. She was getting tired faster, and her back was hurting more often. I tried to be there for her, helping her as much as I could. We began to discuss plans for the birth, where we would go, how we would organize everything. Lindsay chose a hospital where she felt comfortable, and we made arrangements with the doctor for the birth. She started going to pregnancy classes, where she was taught proper breathing and relaxation techniques. Sometimes I accompanied her to be there to support her during these important moments. We also talked several times about what the labor process itself would be like. This discussion gave me confidence. I wanted to be by Lindsay's side the moment our son was born. I knew it would not be an easy process, but we prepared for it together. Lindsay was brave despite all the physical challenges that were taking their toll on her body, and I was full of respect for her for that. In the last weeks before labor, she was getting more and more rest. I noticed that her moods were changing. Sometimes she became more irritable, which the doctors said was normal in the last stages of pregnancy. But I sensed that there was still something bigger inside her that was bothering her, though she didn't say it out loud. One night as we were getting ready for bed, Lindsay suddenly spoke of her worries. "Peter," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I keep thinking about how our lives will change after the baby is born. Are you sure we'll be okay?" Her question took me by surprise. I didn't expect her to say that, because she always seemed so sure that we could do it. "Of course we can," I said, trying to sound as confident as I could. "We're together, and that's what matters. We'll get through this, Lindsay." She nodded, but I could see a shadow of doubt in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of having a baby. It was something more. I wanted to ask her what exactly was bothering her, but I decided not to press her. Lindsay would come to the conversation when she was ready. I was there for her, ready to support her in whatever decisions she made. The days dragged on, and soon the moment we had waited so many months for arrived. Lindsay began to feel her first contractions. I immediately packed all the necessary things and took her to the hospital. We were ready for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared us for what lay ahead. The labor was an incredibly stressful time, and when it was finally over, I felt both exhausted and overwhelmed. The baby was born healthy, and when I held him in my arms for the first time, everything that had been worrying me, all the doubts, all the fears faded into the background. This was our son. His tiny fingers clenched around my thumb, and I felt an incredible wave of love that engulfed my entire being. I stood in the room holding him and couldn't believe this was actually happening. But joy was quickly replaced by anxiety. Lindsay didn't look well at all. Her face was pale, her breathing uneven. The doctors rushed over to her, discussing something among themselves, and I could see that their faces were full of worry. One of the doctors, who stood closest, turned to me. "We're doing everything we can," he said, his voice strained, but he tried to remain calm. "Lindsay has lost a lot of blood. We have to stabilize her, but right now it's all up to her body." Those words came down on me like a hammer blow. I stood there not knowing what to do, holding our son tightly in my arms. All the joyous emotions of his birth were immediately replaced by panic. I looked at Lindsay lying on the bed, surrounded by doctors, and couldn't believe that things could go wrong like this. I wasn't prepared for this. We had spent so much time preparing for our baby, thinking about our future, and now the doctors were saying it all depended on if she could handle it. They quickly took her to the NICU, leaving me alone in the room with a newborn in my arms. I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to realize what had just happened. Only one thought pulsed through my mind. Lindsay was in danger. I couldn't afford to lose her. I didn't know what I would do if something happened. It was a terror I never thought I'd have to experience. The hours dragged on endlessly. It was as if time had stopped, and every time one of the nurses entered the room, my heart sank, waiting for news. But no one said anything, only reassured me by telling me that the doctors were still working. I didn't know what to do. Our son was sleeping in his little crib next to me, and I sat next to him, feeling helpless. At one point, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was another doctor or nurse, but when the door of the room opened, I saw Josh. He was standing in the doorway, holding a bouquet of flowers. His appearance was so unexpected that I froze in place for a moment, not knowing how to react. "Hi, Peter," he said quietly, looking at me with an awkward expression on his face. "I came to see how you were doing." I didn't immediately realize what was going on. Why was Josh here? Why did he come? These questions were running through my head, but I was too exhausted to express my thoughts out loud right away. He looked at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib, and then shifted his gaze to me. "I found out Lindsay had given birth, and I decided to come visit you," he continued, clearly feeling out of sorts. My heart raced, and all the tension I'd been feeling for the past few hours suddenly flared up again. I'd pretty much settled down, believing Lindsay that Josh had no role in her life. But his appearance here, at this moment when she was fighting for her life, was like a cold shower. "Why are you here, Josh?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He slowly walked closer, placed the flowers on the table, and sat down in the chair across from me. There was an expression on his face that I couldn't quite make out, either regret or uncertainty. "I just wanted to be supportive," he said, clearly not knowing what else to say. I stared at him, trying to figure out what was really going on. Why had he come? Lindsay had never said he was going to visit us. Was he just a friend who decided to show concern? Or was there something more here that I had yet to find out? We sat in silence for a few minutes, and I didn't know what to say. Eventually, Josh stood up. "I'll go, I won't bother you. If you need anything—" He hesitated, clearly unsure of how to finish the sentence. "Let me know." I nodded, but didn't say anything. Josh left the room, and as soon as the door closed behind him, I felt the tension building in me again. I looked at our son, trying to figure out what it all meant. Time was passing, and every minute seemed like an eternity. I didn't know what was happening to Lindsay, but I feared the worst. The doctors never came with any news, and I sat in the room waiting for at least some hint that she was doing well. Every time I looked at the baby, I felt bitterness and pain. This should have been a happy moment for both of us, but instead I was gripped with fear for her life. Several more hours passed before one of the doctors finally came into my room. My heart beat faster, and I rose from my seat ready to hear whatever he had to say. "Lindsay is in stable condition now," the doctor said, and I felt the tension ease a little. "We've done everything we can to stop the bleeding, but it will take time for her to recover. The most important thing right now is her strength. It all depends on how her body handles this ordeal." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. The doctor explained that she had a long road to recovery, but the chances of success were high. I thanked him for the news, and he walked out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I spent the entirety of that day at the hospital, never leaving Lindsay's room. I sat next to her bed, holding her hand, silently watching her still face. A hurricane of emotions raged inside me. I thought about how we had come to this moment, how much I loved her and how much I feared losing her. With each passing hour, I hoped for the best. The doctors said it would take time for Lindsay to recover, and I believed she would make it. We had been through a lot, and I couldn't imagine my life without her. The baby slept in his crib next to me, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was so small and defenseless, but his presence gave me strength. I knew I had to be strong for him, and for Lindsay's sake. When the doctor returned a few hours later, I didn't know what to expect. The time dragged on unbearably long, and with each passing minute, a sense of dread grew inside me. My mind was spinning with thoughts, one worse than the other, but I didn't want to believe it could have ended so badly. I sat next to our son's crib, looking at his little face, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. When the doctor finally entered the room, his face immediately gave everything away. I knew what he was going to say before he even uttered the words. The doctor lowered his eyes, and a phrase came out of his lips that changed everything. "I'm very sorry, Peter," he began. "Lindsay didn't make it. We did everything we could, but her condition was too severe. She's gone." The world around me froze. In that second, I lost touch with reality. The doctor's words sounded like an echo in the void, a droning noise that didn't reach consciousness. Lindsay? Dead? I couldn't believe it. Something shivered inside me, as if my whole world had collapsed in an instant. I tried to make sense of what he said, but everything around me turned gray and cold. "Lindsay? Dead?" My words came out barely audible. The doctor nodded, and I felt despair overwhelm me. I couldn't believe it. We had just become parents. We had just discussed the future, and here she was gone. It was an unbearable blow. The doctor kept saying something about them doing everything they could, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was completely immersed in my grief. My wife, my beloved Lindsay, with whom I had shared everything in my life, was gone. She was the only person who understood me, supported me, and loved me. And now she was gone. I looked at our newborn son sleeping peacefully in his little crib and couldn't realize the injustice of this moment. He would never know his mother. I was left alone with this child, and I didn't know how I would cope. A chasm opened up inside me, and I could see no turning back. "We can keep the baby in the hospital for a few days so you can recover," the doctor continued, realizing that I needed time to cope with the loss. I nodded without saying a word. I didn't know what to do. All I could do was move on autopilot, performing the mechanical actions that circumstances demanded of me. I left my son at the hospital, promising to return in a couple days to take him home. Home, now it's a place of emptiness. Without Lindsay, it had lost its meaning. When I got home, everything seemed foreign. I walked into the apartment, still not believing what had happened. Everything around me reminded me of Lindsay. Her books, her clothes, her smell. I walked slowly through the rooms, as if afraid to disturb anything. But every single thing reminded me of her absence. It was unbearable. I gathered her things, barely holding back tears. Everything I touched felt sacred, but at the same time a source of pain. A storm of anger and despair raged inside me. How could this have happened? Why had she left now, when our family was just getting started? I sat down on the bed, holding her cell phone in my hands. It was off, and I just held it as my last link to Lindsay. I slowly turned it on, and when the screen lit up, I saw a new message. My heart clenched when I saw that the message was from Josh. "How's our baby boy doing?" Those words hit me like a hammer. Our baby! What the hell is that supposed to mean? I couldn't believe my eyes. The anger that had been smoldering inside of me since her death now flared up with renewed vigor. I realized that Josh wasn't just a friend from the past. He was something more. And he might be the father of the child I thought was mine. All my old fears that I had tried to suppress resurfaced. I remembered those moments when Lindsay had assured me that everything was okay, that the baby was mine. I remembered all her words that had sounded so convincing then. But now those words seemed like lies. Everything felt like a lie. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the anger and despair building up inside me. Lindsay is dead. I can't ask her the truth anymore. I can't accuse her of betrayal. I can't get an explanation. She walked away, leaving me with this burden. And now that Josh sent this message, the whole truth came crashing down on me with unbearable force. I thought about the fact that Lindsay might have been deceiving me all along, that maybe this baby wasn't mine. I couldn't accept that. Anger was eating me up inside. I wanted to smash her phone. I wanted to scream, but what would that change? She's dead, and I'll never know the truth. How could she do this to me? How could she let me believe that we were building a family together when all this time she was tied up with Josh? I felt betrayed, devastated. She was gone, taking with her answers that I would never get. My life, the one I cherished, the one I believed in, had turned out to be a sham. Lindsay had betrayed me, and now I was alone. Alone with a child that may not have been mine. I sat in silence, feeling everything I knew fall apart. Anger and pain intertwined into one unbearable flood of emotions. I wanted to fight, I wanted to know the truth, but now it was impossible. I felt like I was in an endless nightmare from which there was no escape. I couldn't look at the baby without feeling hurt and betrayed. Every time I held him in my arms, I was overcome with mixed emotions. Love and anger, bitterness and pain. I knew it wasn't his fault. He was just a baby, an innocent being. But he became to me the embodiment of everything I had lost. I couldn't accept him as my son. For the first few weeks after coming home, I tried to nurse him. It was a long and agonizing process. I stayed up nights feeding him, changing his diapers, comforting him when he cried. But every time I looked into his face, I was in unbearable pain. Everything I saw was a reminder that this baby was not mine, and that Lindsay, whom I loved so much, had betrayed me in the most despicable way. Sometimes at night, when the baby was asleep, I would sit in the dark and just stare into the void. Depression was eating away at me. I felt broken. I had no one to turn to for help. My whole life seemed meaningless without Lindsay. My days became a monotonous struggle with life itself. I cared for the child, but I couldn't feel the bond that should have been formed between father and son. It was too difficult for me, too painful. Every day I tried to convince myself that in time something would change, that I would be able to accept him, but it wasn't happening. He kept reminding me of Lindsay's betrayal. When I looked at him, I didn't just see a child. I saw Josh, and that thought drove me crazy. It made me furious just thinking that the two of them, Lindsay and Josh, were deceiving me. How could she look me in the eye all this time, go to bed next to me, talk about love, knowing she was carrying another man's child? My life became a vicious cycle of pain and resentment. Every morning I woke up feeling like this wasn't my life, that everything was some kind of nightmare I couldn't get out of. I tried to be strong for the sake of the baby, but it was getting harder every day. I felt completely alone. No one could understand the pain I was in. No one could help me. One night, on a particularly difficult night, when the baby wouldn't stop crying and I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I had to make a decision. I couldn't go on living like this. It was too hard for me to be alone with a baby who reminded me of my wife's betrayal. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I sat down at my desk and started writing a letter to Josh. It was one of the hardest decisions of my life, but I knew it was best for everyone. After all, Josh was the father of a child. And as painful as it was for me, I realized that this child deserved love and care, the kind of love I couldn't give him. Josh, I've thought about this for a long time, and now I realize it's the only right decision. You know, Lindsay's gone. I've tried to cope, tried to be a father to this child, but it's getting harder every day. He's not mine, and I can't accept him as mine. I can't live with this pain and betrayal. The baby is yours, and I want you to take responsibility for his future. That doesn't mean I haven't taken care of him. I've tried, but I can't go on. I'm asking you to take him. He needs a father, and I can't be that man. Peter. I sat over that letter for a long time, rereading it over and over, trying to realize the finality of my decision. It wasn't just a step back. It was a goodbye to what was left of my life with Lindsay. I knew I couldn't go back to a normal life after all of this. But I also realized I couldn't hold on to false hopes. I would never be able to love this child the way I was supposed to. And it was killing me. A few days later, Josh came to pick up the baby. I didn't want to look him in the eye. I didn't want any communication. I just handed the baby over and walked away, feeling something inside me break completely. I heard the baby cry as Josh picked him up, but I didn't turn around. It was too painful, too unbearable for me to look at them. When I got home afterward, there was an emptiness inside me. It seemed like everything in my life was gone, that nothing mattered anymore. Lindsay had betrayed me. The child I was raising wasn't mine, and now I was alone. I didn't know what would happen next, and I didn't care. From that day on, I was a shadow of myself. Life continued to go on, but I no longer felt any sense of purpose in it. I had lost everything: my wife, my child, my faith in people. I was consumed with pain and a sense of betrayal. I couldn't forgive Lindsay, but I couldn't take back what we had. All the dreams I'd built, all the plans for the future, all of it was gone with her.